Hello, welcome back to Sports in the University. My name is Blakey Vermeulen. My guest today is Brianna Bain, who graduated from Stanford in 2015, and during her time at Stanford, she was the four-time Pac-12 champion and an All-American javelin thrower. She was also a psych major, and she now works in the financial services industry. So welcome, Brianna.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So to get our conversation started, I guess I should ask, sort of looking back at it, how do you think that being an athlete shaped your time at Stanford?
Being an athlete completely shaped my time at Stanford. By that I mean most of what I did was structured around my training schedule. In one sense, it keeps you from seizing certain opportunities simply because of how time-consuming training and competing is. There are certain classes you can't take if they're during your practice schedule, for example, but the experience overall was just invaluable. Stanford gave me access to several mentors, including my coaches and staff dedicated to athletes, but also a network of other athletes. I met some of my best friends through athletics. I think the most important thing that athletics gave me in terms of life skills was time management. When you have class and practice to account for, you really only have a few short windows of time to get reading and work done. So using time effectively was so important, and it's very important to me now, even though I'm no longer in school.
Do you think that there are distinctive things about being a female athlete?
There are definitely distinctions. While males involved in athletics are essentially working towards their societal masculine ideal, women are not. This is especially true as a thrower. It's a stereotypically masculine thing to do. It's very aggressive and strong. So there's a certain level of confidence that you need to fully commit to something that's not stereotypically feminine.
What, in your experience, are the main challenges facing female athletes?
I think the biggest challenge is facing those stereotypes that I mentioned. Women don't often get the chance to be competitive and aggressive without ridicule. They often feel pressure to be delicate and elegant in day-to-day life, which isn't something that you can be when you're competing at a high level. I feel like every time I walked onto the track to compete, I was almost embodying an alternate personality, if you will. You need to face those stereotypes head on. My teammates and I would often discuss what uniforms we wanted to wear on meet day and which ones we looked best in, and I would often stop and think about how ridiculous that was, that we were concerned with how we were going to look. It's just so arbitrary considering what we were trying to do, which was throw far. So subconscious distractions like this are very challenging to ignore and can get in the way of what you're trying to accomplish.
Is there a certain body type that works especially well for being a javelin thrower? And how does that body type maybe conflict with sort of stereotypical feminine ideals that we're all, imbued with from a young age?
Sure. So in terms of body type, there are so many different body types. If you look at javelin throwers, tall, short, thin, wide, what have you.
Really? So there's no advantage in height particularly, or having, say, a long wingspan or something like that?
So there is definitely an advantage, especially those two things, height and wingspan give you a huge leg up, but, they're not completely necessary to be successful or to throw far. So for me, ideally, in the javelin world, I would be 7 feet tall and 300 pounds and be the strongest person in the world. But as you mentioned, from in day-to-day life, would I want to have that stature? It'd probably be very difficult.
So being an athlete is part of your identity, or was when you were here certainly a huge part of your identity. But then there are whole other parts of your identity that are maybe just as important to you.
Yeah, so this is something that I really noticed after I left Stanford, because when I came in, there were times where I was told to gain weight. There were times I was told to lose weight for, various reasons, whether I was trying to gain speed in my throw or, maybe utilize more power than speed. And I just got into this mindset while I was training that my body is being used to throw the javelin, and everything that I did and the way my body was all to make the javelin go further. And so that was what I was focusing on. And when I left school and I was no longer in this mindset of training, I kind of snapped out of it, and I was like, wait a minute, I don't have to be this big, strong person anymore. I mean, it is very empowering to be that way and to kind of control that, but it made me realize how different the ideals were in the javelin world versus society, because there's so much pressure on women to just maintain, a certain look or a certain body type or style or what have you. So you really notice that when you're focusing on being a certain way.
Was this something, I'm curious, just in the course of your time as a competitor, that ever sort of came up explicitly amongst your teammates? I mean, was this something you talked about or had some solidarity around, or just, processed with each other? I mean, I hate to use the word consciousness raising, but was there anything like that in your experience?
Yeah, it was actually a very open conversation between myself and all my teammates. I'd imagine it's not like that everywhere, but we were all very close. We would have regular weigh-ins every week. So it was definitely a conversation that came up, either I'm going to be too heavy today, or I'm going to be too light today, or, I had a really light lunch before this weigh-in, or things like that. So we'd all talk about it, and we were all very aware of, how everyone felt about this and just how conscious everyone was about it. But I think for the most part, everyone was pretty realistic about, I'm here seriously training for something, and my body type does matter and does affect how I perform. So I think everyone was invested enough to take it seriously.
Did you have a program of sort of intensive weight training as an athlete? Was that part of your training?
Yeah, weightlifting was a really big part of our training, more so for shot put, discus, hammer throwers, but it's very important for javelin as well. We would lift usually 3 days a week.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a really pretty intense lifestyle to be a student athlete. At Stanford, did you ever feel any sort of tension between your life as an athlete, which is, after all, like a full-time job, basically, and being a student, or did you feel that Stanford gave you pathways to help manage those two roles?
I think Stanford is really good about allowing athletes to feel like normal students or non-athletes, I guess. One thing they do is they always pair athletes with non-athletes in dorm rooms, just so that you end up meeting people that aren't on your team, because that kind of ends up happening. So I think they do a really good job of that and being conscientious of that.
How do you think that universities or even the NCAA or even just society could improve things for female athletes?
I think news coverage needs to change significantly. News outlets cater to male audiences, which usually means more coverage of men's sports and poor coverage of women's sports. This is especially apparent when you analyze outlets like Sports Illustrated. Women are just quite frankly portrayed as sex objects rather than the strong, successful athletes that they are, and that just ends up being overshadowed by how they look. And what this does is it just puts more pressure on women to be seen in this light, even while they're competing, which is completely besides the point of athletics. So I think universities and the NCAA are very objective when it comes to media coverage of women's sports, but I'd like to see better coverage, meaning objective coverage and more coverage of women's sports from major news and sports outlets.
You majored in psychology at Stanford, and there's a field of study specific to sports psychology. Are there any interesting insights from that helped you? Were there things that you could apply to your own training and competition?
Of course. Mental preparation is a huge thing, and it takes continuous practice. It's a very, very real and important aspect of training, especially in track and field where there's so much pressure. You're competing one by one, and you're completely alone on the runway, and all eyes are on you, and you need to perform this action that takes a split second. You only get a few attempts, so it's a lot of pressure. I applied so many aspects of sports psychology to my mental training. To name a few tools that I used, I would meditate regularly as an attempt to more or less control my body's arousal state. I would use affirmations for confidence, so I'd repeat statements to myself that empowered me. I practiced positive self-talk. I was very aware of how I was talking to myself always and how that was impacting my mindset. And I also use conditioning. I had a key word that I would say before starting a throw that I used to give me a routine so that I could clear my head before I would throw.
A lot of people think of athletic training and academic training, so the life of the body and the life of the mind as pretty different things. How did academics and athletics go together in your time at Stanford?
One of the things that I loved most about studying psychology was how much it applied to my own life and how much of the information I was learning that I could use immediately. I essentially aligned my athletic goals and my academic goals to complement each other while I was here. I used the elements that I mentioned previously, and they all helped me with my mental state on and off the track. My mental game ended up being one of my most consistent strengths, I would say. I was a very consistent competitor and had several clutch throws throughout my career, which I completely attribute to my mental training and preparation. And there's no way I would have been able to incorporate these things into my training regimen had I not had that psychology background.
That is completely fascinating. Well, you're a champion athlete, and you've made now the transition from being a college athlete to a professional person. You have a life away from athletics. What has that been like for you?
Honestly, it's been really tough. When you're so invested in training and competing at a high level, it becomes a part of your identity. I saw myself and others saw me as a javelin thrower. When that's no longer a part of your present identity and you move on to focus on something else like a professional career, you feel as if you're starting over, starting from the bottom to build something else for yourself. I'll always have my javelin career, of course, but I really had to redirect that focus to something else. I'm comfortable with where I am now, and I feel like I'm on a great path professionally, but it was very difficult at first to give up something that I had been working so hard at for so many years.
What advice would you give to a young woman, say in her junior year of high school, who's beginning to think about pursuing sports in college?
I would urge anyone, male or female, to consider the long-term impact of their decision. What I mean by that is think about where you'll be once your athletic career is over. Being a college athlete is great. It's an invaluable experience for so many reasons, but when that 4 years is up, you're going to be left with a degree and a network. So with that, I'll say prioritize more things than just a school's athletic program. For the females especially, I'd encourage them to fully embody who they are as an athlete, be comfortable being aggressive, and allow yourself to gain some self-esteem from that, because challenging stereotypes can be so empowering. It's just about how you approach it.
Well, thank you so much, Brianna, for talking to us, and I really wish you luck with your future life, both professional and athletic, whatever form that athletic set of pursuits takes.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
It's great. Thanks.